It was a chilly Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the air seemed to nip at your skin and the clouds hung heavy with the promise of rain. Inside the small neighborhood grocery store, things were as ordinary as ever. The familiar beeping of the cash registers mixed with the chatter of customers asking about prices, the shuffling of feet across the tile floor, and the faint hum of the store's air conditioning. Shelves were being stocked, carts were being filled, and people were going about their routines, barely glancing at one another. Emily Dawson was one of the few employees who moved through this humdrum rhythm without complaint. She worked quietly, efficiently, dressed in the plain store uniform of a green polo shirt and khaki pants. Her long brown hair was tied back in a practical ponytail, and her name tag, slightly worn, hung crookedly on her chest. To most people, she was just another grocery clerk, a young woman in her early 20s, quietly trying to make a living. Emily spent her afternoon in aisle 3, stacking cans of soup and vegetables with precision. It was repetitive work, but she didn't mind. She liked keeping her hands busy. As she placed the last can of tomato soup onto the shelf, she paused for a moment to stretch, glancing around the store. She saw the usual cast of characters, a mother with 2 kids in tow, a middle-aged man squinting at a shopping list, and a couple of teenagers giggling over something in the candy aisle. To everyone else, Emily was just another employee blending into the background. She didn't stand out, and she preferred it that way. But Emily Dawson had a secret, one she kept hidden beneath her calm exterior and polite demeanor. Emily wasn't just a grocery clerk. She wasn't the type to brag, and she had no interest in showing off. But if anyone knew the truth about her, they'd see her in a very different light. For years, Emily had been training in mixed martial arts, dedicating her evenings and weekends to perfecting every strike, every block, every takedown. She wasn't just good at it, she was exceptional. Competitions, trophies, belts, Emily had earned them all, but she never let that part of her life bleed into her day job. To Emily, the grocery store was her escape. It was a place where she didn't have to be on guard, where she could just focus on something simple and steady. But that peaceful facade was about to be shattered. The first sign of trouble was the rumble of engines outside. Deep, growling sounds echoed through the parking lot, growing louder and louder until they seemed to shake the very ground. Emily straightened up, her sharp instincts kicking in as she recognized the unmistakable roar of motorcycles. A few customers glanced toward the entrance as the sound grew louder, their curiosity quickly turning to unease. Moments later, the automatic doors slid open, and they walked in. A group of 6 bikers strode into the store, their presence impossible to ignore. Clad in leather jackets covered with patches, jeans, and heavy boots, they moved with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Their laughter was loud, their voices carrying over the soft background music. They were here to make an impression, and they were succeeding. Emily watched them out of the corner of her eye as she went back to stacking cans. She wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but there was something about the way they moved, the deliberate, almost predatory way they claimed space in the store, that made her uneasy. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard and sunglasses perched on his head, walked at the front, his boots clunking heavily against the tile floor. The others followed close behind, their hands brushing against shelves as they passed, occasionally knocking items out of place. Emily's co-workers exchanged nervous glances from behind the checkout counters. One of them, a young man named David, whispered, "Great. Just what we needed today." "Just ignore them," another clerk muttered. "They'll leave eventually." Emily said nothing, her hands steady as she placed another row of cans on the shelf. She wasn't the type to jump into situations unnecessarily, but she kept her ears open, her sharp mind assessing the group's behavior. The bikers wandered through the aisles, their voices growing louder as they joked and called out to each other. They weren't just shopping, they were making their presence known. A few customers quickly finished their business and left, not wanting to stick around. Emily couldn't help but notice how the bikers seemed to thrive on the discomfort they caused. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head, picked up a bag of chips and ripped it open, munching loudly as he walked. Another grabbed a soda from the fridge and started drinking it without paying, leaving the empty bottle on a random shelf. They weren't just disruptive, they were testing boundaries. Emily's sharp eyes followed their movements without turning her head. She wasn't looking for trouble, but she wasn't about to let them push people around unchecked, either. It wasn't until they reached aisle 3 that things started to escalate. "Hey, look at this," one of the bikers said, his voice dripping with mockery. He picked up a can of soup and tossed it into the air, catching it clumsily. "Bet this stuff tastes like garbage." His friend snickered. "Yeah, but it's cheap. Probably all she can afford." He nodded toward Emily, his tone laced with derision. Emily didn't react. She kept her focus on the shelves, her movements calm and deliberate. "Hey, girlie," the leader called out, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a few nearby customers. "You gonna help us find the good stuff, or are you just gonna stand there?" The group laughed, their voices echoing through the aisle. Emily turned slightly, her face neutral as she met the leader's gaze. "Let me know if you need anything," she said simply, her tone polite but firm. The leader smirked, clearly enjoying himself. "Oh, we'll let you know," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Emily nodded and turned back to her work, her heart steady, her mind already running through possible scenarios. She wasn't afraid, she hadn't been afraid in a long time. But she also knew better than to underestimate a group like this. For Emily, it was just another shift. For them, it was about to become a day they'd never forget. The bikers lingered in aisle 3 longer than necessary, their presence an unwelcome disruption to the otherwise peaceful afternoon. Emily could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch or quicken her pace. She placed each can carefully, aligning the labels with the precision she'd grown accustomed to. "How about you tell us where you keep the steaks, huh?" another biker said, his voice carrying a mocking tone. He was shorter than the others but made up for it with bravado, his grin wide and toothy as he leaned against a shelf. "Yeah, and while you're at it," the one with the shaved head chimed in, "maybe fetch us a cold one too. You look like you'd make a great waitress." More laughter followed, but Emily didn't bite. She simply glanced at them, her face blank, and went back to her work. Her lack of reaction seemed to annoy them more than if she'd responded. "Not much of a talker, huh?" the leader said, stepping closer. He had a way of invading personal space that set her co-workers and the remaining customers on edge. But Emily didn't so much as take a step back. She remained rooted, calm, and poised. "Just doing my job," she replied evenly. It wasn't the answer they were looking for. The leader grabbed a can of soup from the shelf and turned it over in his hands. "Doing your job, huh? Bet you're real proud of this." He turned to the others, shaking the can mockingly. "She's building an empire, one soup can at a time." The laughter that followed echoed louder than before. A few customers nearby shuffled away, pretending not to notice, while Emily's co-worker David peeked nervously from behind the counter. Emily continued to stack the cans, refusing to engage further. She knew their type, people who thrived on attention, who pushed others until they got a reaction. Giving them what they wanted would only escalate the situation. But the bikers weren't used to being ignored. One of them, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his arms, stepped forward and deliberately knocked over the stack of cans Emily had just finished arranging. They clattered to the floor in a metallic cascade, rolling across the tiles and into other shelves. "Oops," he said, feigning innocence. "Guess my hand slipped." The store fell silent, the only sound the faint buzzing of fluorescent lights above. All eyes turned to Emily, waiting to see how she would react. Emily slowly straightened up, her face betraying no emotion as she looked at the mess on the floor. Then, Without a word, she crouched down and began picking up the cans one by one. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the man snapped, irritated by her calmness. He stepped closer, but Emily didn't look up. "You shouldn't have done that," a voice piped up from behind the counter. It was David, his face pale but determined. His words hung in the air, surprising everyone, including himself. The leader turned to face him, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "And what are you gonna do about it, Junior?" he sneered, taking a step toward the register. David immediately regretted speaking up, shrinking back behind the counter. Emily finished stacking the cans she'd gathered, stood up, and turned to face the bikers. Her expression remained calm, her eyes steady as they met the leader's gaze. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice firm but quiet. The leader chuckled, clearly amused. "Oh, you've got a bit of a backbone after all," he said, his tone mocking. "That's cute. But you're not exactly in a position to give orders, are you?" Emily didn't respond. She simply stood there, her hands resting at her sides, her posture relaxed but alert. "What's your problem, huh?" another biker said, stepping forward. "Think you're too good to talk to us?" The tension in the store was thick now, an almost tangible weight pressing down on everyone present. Customers hovered at the edges of aisles, peeking around corners but staying out of sight. The bikers weren't just being obnoxious anymore, they were testing boundaries, pushing to see how far they could go. And Emily, despite her calm exterior, could feel the shift. Emily's co-workers had seen her handle difficult customers before, but this was different. Most people backed down when faced with such brazen aggression. But Emily didn't back down, and that unnerved the bikers more than they cared to admit. The leader leaned in closer, towering over her, his smirk faltering just slightly when he realized she wasn't intimidated. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his tone laced with condescension. Still, Emily didn't respond. She had learned long ago that silence was a powerful tool. It forced people to fill the void with their own assumptions, their own insecurities. "You think you're better than us?" the wiry man with tattoos snapped, stepping forward again. This time, his voice had an edge of frustration. "No," Emily said simply, her tone devoid of fear or malice. "I just think you don't belong here." "That did it?" The wiry man lunged forward, his hand outstretched to grab her arm. But what happened next shocked everyone, including the bikers. Emily moved like water fluid, effortless and precise. She sidestepped his reach with a grace that seemed almost unnatural, her hand coming up to deflect his grasp with minimal effort. The motion was so quick, so controlled, that it took a moment for everyone to process what had happened. The wiry man stumbled forward, his balance thrown off by her maneuver. He turned to face her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What the?" he began, but the words caught in his throat. Emily was still standing there, her posture unchanged, her face calm. It was as if nothing had happened. The leader's smirk faded completely now, replaced by a cautious wariness. Well, he said slowly, his voice losing some of its bravado. "Looks like the little grocery girl's got some moves." Emily didn't reply. She didn't need to. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence shaken but not entirely gone. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked as unassuming as Emily. David, still watching from behind the counter, felt a spark of hope. He didn't know much about Emily's personal life, no one did, really, but he'd always sensed there was more to her than met the eye. "Maybe we should just leave," one of the younger bikers muttered, his voice barely audible. "Shut up," the leader snapped, glaring at him. He wasn't about to let some grocery clerk embarrass him in front of his crew. Emily watched them closely, her sharp eyes catching every subtle movement. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she was prepared for one. Years of training had taught her the value of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act. "You've had your fun," she said quietly, her voice steady and measured. "It's time to go." The leader barked out a laugh, though it sounded forced. "You're real tough, huh? Think you can take all of us?" Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. The leader's confidence wavered for a split second, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "All right," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's see what you've got." The store fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. The bikers moved through the store like a storm, loud and reckless, their laughter filling every corner. They grabbed snacks, bottles of soda, and cans of beer from the shelves, tossing them carelessly into their cart. Their swagger wasn't just confidence, it was a display, a challenge to anyone who might dare to confront them. They paused in the candy aisle, shoving one another and cracking crude jokes about the items they found. One picked up a box of chocolates, held it up, and smirked. "Hey, maybe we should get this for the lady stocking shelves. Looks like she could use something sweet in her life." The others laughed, their voices carrying over the aisles. Emily, standing in the baking section nearby, heard the comment but didn't react. She placed the last can on the shelf and moved on to the next task, her movements steady and deliberate. But ignoring them seemed to feed their energy. "Hey, girlie," one of them called out, leaning on the end of the aisle. His voice was sharp and mocking, designed to draw attention. "Yeah, you. I'm talking to you." Emily didn't turn around. She bent down to pick up a box of flour and placed it carefully on the shelf. The biker, a burly man with a patchy beard, didn't like being ignored. He strolled toward her, his heavy boots thudding against the tile. "What's the matter? Too good to talk to us?" Emily still didn't respond. Her focus remained on the shelves in front of her, her calmness unwavering. Behind the counter, her co-workers exchanged uneasy glances. David, the cashier who had been working the register for over a year, whispered to Jessica, the shift supervisor. "Should we call someone? This feels like it's getting out of hand." Jessica bit her lip, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Let's wait. She hasn't asked for help yet." "But they're cornering her," David hissed. "Look at them." The burly biker had been joined by another, a wiry man with a skull tattoo covering his left forearm. He leaned against the shelf, blocking Emily's path. "Come on, don't be shy," he said with a crooked grin. "We're just trying to be friendly." Emily straightened up, turning to face them. Her eyes flicked from one to the other, calm but assessing. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, her voice steady and polite. The burly biker chuckled. "Oh, she talks. See, wasn't so hard, was it? We're just wondering why you're so quiet," the wiry man added, his grin widening. "Makes a guy wonder what you're hiding." Emily didn't flinch. She'd seen this kind of behavior before, men who mistook her quiet demeanor for weakness. They didn't know who she was or what she was capable of. The bikers were too focused on her to notice the way her co-workers watched nervously from the counter or how a few customers hurriedly left the store, avoiding any eye contact. Jessica's hand hovered over the phone, but she hesitated. Emily didn't look afraid, and there was something about her posture, calm yet alert, that made Jessica pause. The burly biker leaned closer, his grin fading as he tried to provoke her further. "You're not scared, are you? Don't worry, we're not gonna bite." Emily stepped to the side, creating just enough space between them. "If you're done shopping, the register's that way," she said, motioning toward the front. Her tone was measured, neither confrontational nor submissive. The wiry man laughed, a high-pitched sound that grated against the quiet tension of the store. "You hear that? She's trying to boss us around." The burly biker smirked. "That's cute. But I don't think you get to tell us what to do, sweetheart." Emily didn't respond. She held their gaze for a moment before turning back to her work, her movements unhurried. That seemed to push the burly biker over the edge. He reached out and grabbed a box of flour from the shelf, tossing it to the floor. The box burst open, sending a cloud of white powder into the air. The store fell silent, all eyes on Emily. Her co-workers froze, their hearts racing as they waited to see what she would do. Emily looked at the mess on the floor, then back at the bikers. Her face remained calm, her breathing steady. "Was that necessary?" she asked quietly. The burly biker grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "Just having a little fun. What are you gonna do about it?" The wiry man laughed again, but there was a nervous edge to it this time. He nudged his friend. "Come on, man. She's just a stock girl. Let's grab our stuff and go." But the burly biker wasn't ready to back down. He stepped closer, his grin faltering as he realized she wasn't intimidated. Emily shifted her weight slightly, positioning herself so that she could move quickly if she needed to. Her years of MMA training had taught her to read body language, and she could see the tension building in the man's posture. She wasn't here to fight, but she wasn't going to let them push her around, either. "I think it's time for you to leave," she said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her co-workers. The burly biker's grin disappeared completely. "Or what?" he growled, stepping closer. Emily didn't blink. "Or I'll have to ask you again. And you won't like the way I do it." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The wiry man hesitated, his eyes darting between his friend and Emily. "Hey, man, maybe we should listen to her. This place has cameras, you know." The burly biker glared at him but didn't move. He was caught between his pride and the growing realization that Emily wasn't the easy target he'd assumed she was. From the counter, Jessica finally picked up the phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. But before she could dial, Emily raised a hand, signaling her to wait. Jessica hesitated, then slowly set the phone down, her heart pounding. The bikers stared at Emily, their bravado faltering under her steady gaze. For a moment, it seemed like they might back off. But then the burly biker sneered, his ego getting the better of him. "You're lucky we're feeling generous," he said, stepping back. He turned to the others and jerked his head toward the exit. "Come on, let's get outta here. This place is a dump anyway." The wiry man was quick to follow, casting one last uneasy glance at Emily before disappearing down the aisle. The leader lingered for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You've got guts, girl," he said, his tone a mix of grudging respect and lingering hostility. "But don't think we're done here." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing alone in the aisle. Her co-workers let out a collective sigh of relief as the bikers' voices faded into the distance. David leaned against the counter, his hands trembling. "What just happened?" he whispered. Jessica shook her head, her eyes still on Emily. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But I think we just saw a side of her none of us knew existed." Emily bent down to clean up the spilled flour, her movements as calm and deliberate as ever. She didn't look shaken or rattled. In fact, she looked as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened at all. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The bikers would be back. And next time, they wouldn't just test her patience. The bell over the store door jingled, signaling the bikers' exit, but the uneasy silence they left behind lingered. Emily continued sweeping up the spilled flour, her movements calm and deliberate, but her co-workers couldn't stop whispering. "Did you see that?" David muttered, his eyes wide. She didn't even flinch. "I thought they were going to." Jessica cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Not now, David. Just, get back to the register." David nodded reluctantly, casting one last glance at Emily before resuming his post. Jessica approached her slowly, keeping her voice low. "Are you okay?" Emily nodded without looking up. "I'm fine. It's not the first time someone's tried to intimidate me." "That was more than intimidation," Jessica said, glancing toward the door as though the bikers might storm back in. "You handled it better than I would've, but, what if they come back?" Emily paused, the broom still in her hands. "If they come back, we'll deal with it." Her tone was calm but resolute, leaving no room for argument. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Emily's confidence than just a cool head under pressure. As the store settled back into its usual rhythm, Emily returned to her tasks. But her thoughts lingered on the encounter. The burly biker's final words echoed in her mind, "Don't think we're done here." Emily had faced worse threats in her life, both inside and outside the MMA ring. She knew how to read people, and these men weren't just blowing off steam, they were testing her. And while she preferred to avoid conflict, she also knew when it was time to stand her ground. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. Customers came and went, the store's hum returning to its usual rhythm. But the tension in the air was unmistakable. Jessica kept glancing toward the door, half expecting the bikers to return. David was jittery, jumping every time the bell over the entrance rang. Even the customers seemed on edge, their voices hushed as they moved through the aisles. Emily, however, remained unfazed. She moved through her tasks with quiet efficiency, her mind sharp and focused. She wasn't the type to let fear dictate her actions, but she also wasn't naive. The bikers would be back, it was just a matter of when. Her years of training had taught her to stay prepared, both physically and mentally. Mixed martial arts wasn't just a sport for Emily, it was a discipline, a way of life. It had taught her patience, control, and the importance of staying one step ahead of her opponent. She thought back to the burly biker's stance, the way his shoulders tensed when he spoke to her. He was the type who relied on intimidation, expecting people to back down at the first sign of aggression. But when that didn't work, he'd escalate. And that's what worried her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the store's fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a pale glow over the aisles. The evening shift had begun, and the number of customers dwindled to a handful. Emily was in the stockroom, arranging new shipments, when she heard the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles outside. Her heart rate remained steady, but her muscles tensed instinctively. She set down the box she was carrying and stepped toward the door, listening. The rumble grew louder, then stopped. A moment later, the bell over the front door jingled. David's voice came over the intercom, shaky and uncertain. Emily. Can you come to the front?" Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. She pushed the stockroom door open and walked toward the front of the store. There they were. The burly biker stood in the middle of the store, flanked by three others. The wiry man with the skull tattoo was among them, along with two new faces, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter but stocky, with a scar running down his cheek. The burly biker's grin was back, but it didn't reach his eyes. He held a six-pack of beer in one hand, tapping the top can with his fingers. "Evening, sweetheart," he drawled. "Miss us?" Emily didn't answer. She stopped a few feet away, her posture relaxed but ready. Jessica hovered near the counter, her hand resting on the phone. David stood frozen behind the register, his face pale. The tall biker stepped forward, glancing around the store. "Quiet night, huh? Figured we'd swing by and liven things up." The scarred biker chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Hope you don't mind." Emily's gaze didn't waver. "If you're here to shop, feel free. But if you're here to cause trouble, I suggest you leave." Her voice was calm but firm, carrying an edge that made the wiry man shift uncomfortably. The burly biker tilted his head, his grin fading. "You've got a mouth on you, don't you? I don't like being told what to do." And I don't like cleaning up after you, Emily replied evenly. So let's keep this civil. The tension in the air was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. Jessica's fingers hovered over the phone keypad, her breath shallow. The burly biker took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. You think you're tough, don't you? Emily didn't back down. I think you're out of line. For a moment, the store was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Then the burly biker laughed, a short, sharp sound that sent a chill through the room. You've got guts, he said, shaking his head. I'll give you that. He turned to his crew, motioning toward the door. Come on, boys. Let's get out of here. This place ain't worth our time. The other bikers hesitated, glancing between their leader and Emily. But one by one, they followed him out, the bell over the door jingling as they left. Emily watched them go, her expression unreadable. She knew this wasn't the end. As soon as the bikers were gone, Jessica rushed over, her voice low but urgent. Emily, we need to call the police. This is getting serious. Emily shook her head. Not yet. They haven't done anything illegal. They're harassing you. Jessica insisted. That's enough of a reason. They're testing me, Emily said calmly. If we escalate, so will they. I'll handle it. Jessica stared at her, frustration and concern warring on her face. Handle it how? Emily, this isn't just about you. What if they hurt someone else? Emily met her gaze, her eyes steady. I won't let that happen. David, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. But, how can you be so sure? They're dangerous, Emily. I know, Emily said quietly. But so am I. Her co-workers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to make of her words. Jessica sighed, rubbing her temples. Just promise me you'll be careful, okay? If they come back, I'm calling the cops, no matter what. Emily nodded. Fair enough. As the night wore on, the store emptied out, leaving Emily alone to close up. She double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, her senses alert. The bikers might be gone for now, but she knew they weren't done. And neither was she. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching uncomfortably across the aisles. The burly leader, towering over the nervous store manager, smirked at the small crowd of employees and customers frozen in place. Emily remained still, her eyes steady as she watched the situation unfold. She didn't fidget or glance away, her posture neither aggressive nor submissive. The leader tilted his head, noticing her gaze. What's this? He said with a mock laugh. The little clerk thinks she's a tough guy now. His buddies chuckled, their voices echoing in the quiet store. One of them, a wiry man with a crooked grin, stepped forward. Maybe she's the store's bouncer. What do you think, Tiny? He said, jabbing a thumb toward their stockiest member. Tiny, who wasn't tiny at all, snorted and cracked his knuckles. She doesn't look like much, he muttered. The store manager wrung his hands, his voice shaky. Gentlemen, please, if you don't calm down, I'll have to ask you to leave. Leave, the leader barked, his booming laugh cutting him off. He leaned closer to the manager, towering over him. You don't ask us anything, old man. The tension tightened, a thread pulled taut and ready to snap. Emily stepped forward, drawing the leader's attention. Her co-workers watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of the way. The leader's grin widened as Emily approached, her plain uniform and quiet demeanor offering no threat to his oversized ego. He spread his arms theatrically. Well, look who's brave enough to step up. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she calmly picked up the toppled display, her movements measured. Her silence seemed to irritate him more than any sharp retort could have. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue, the wiry biker taunted, stepping closer. He bent slightly, invading her personal space. Still, Emily said nothing. She didn't flinch, didn't glare, didn't give them anything to feed off of. The leader's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Emily caught it. She knew the type men who relied on dominance and bravado. They expected fear, compliance, or at the very least, anger. Her composure threw him off balance, even if he didn't realize it yet. The wiry man reached out as if to tap her shoulder, but Emily straightened suddenly, her sharp eyes locking onto his. It was a look not angry, not afraid, but direct and unyielding. He froze mid-motion, his hand retreating awkwardly. Tiny snickered. Looks like she's got some fire after all. The leader waved him off, trying to regain control of the moment. Come on, boys. Let's not waste our time with her. She's just a little mouse playing brave. He turned to walk away, but his steps were slower now, his swagger diminished. As the bikers wandered toward the back of the store, making a show of grabbing random items and laughing loudly, Emily returned to her co-workers. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice a harsh whisper. What were you thinking? You can't just stare them down like that. They're looking for trouble. I know, Emily replied simply, her voice calm. David chimed in, his face pale. You don't understand, Emily. Those guys aren't just messing around. They're part of a local gang. People say they've got connections, serious ones. Emily gave a small shrug. They're bullies. Bullies thrive on fear. If we don't give them that, they lose their power. Jessica stared at her, incredulous. You make it sound so simple. But they're dangerous. They're not the first dangerous people I've met, Emily said, her tone quiet but firm. Her co-workers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to make of her cryptic response. As the bikers continued their antics, Emily's thoughts drifted to her training. She'd spent years honing her skills in mixed martial arts, not just learning techniques, but mastering the discipline, the mental clarity required to face threats. Her coach's words echoed in her mind, it's not about proving you're the strongest. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Emily had no intention of starting a fight in the middle of the grocery store. But she also wasn't about to let these men intimidate her or anyone else. The bikers lingered, their laughter grating against the store's usual hum. Customers avoided them, hurrying through their shopping with nervous glances. At one point, Tiny grabbed a box of cereal and ripped it open, spilling its contents onto the floor. Oops, he said with a smirk, mimicking the leader's earlier taunt. Emily was there in seconds, broom in hand. She didn't look at Tiny, didn't acknowledge his sneer. She simply cleaned up the mess and moved on. Her indifference was like a mirror, reflecting their childish behavior back at them. The leader watched her, his grin faltering again. Hey, Mouse, he called out, his voice loud enough to turn heads. You're pretty quick with that broom. Maybe you should try out for a janitor competition or something. His friends erupted in laughter, but Emily didn't react. She bent to pick up a stray piece of cereal, her movements deliberate. She wasn't ignoring them out of fear, she was choosing to deny them the reaction they wanted. The leader's amusement began to wane. He leaned against a shelf, watching her with narrowed eyes. There was something about her calm that unnerved him, though he couldn't put his finger on it. As the evening wore on, the bikers finally made their way to the checkout counter, their cart overflowing with random items. David rang them up with trembling hands, his voice barely above a whisper as he announced the total. The leader tossed a wad of crumpled bills onto the counter. Keep the change, he said with a smirk, though the amount was far short of the total. Jessica stepped forward, her voice shaking. Sir, this doesn't cover. Don't worry about it, the leader interrupted, leaning closer. Consider it a tip for putting up with us. Emily appeared at Jessica's side, her calm presence immediately noticeable. She placed a hand on Jessica's arm, a silent signal to step back. The leader turned to her, his smirk returning. "You've got something to say, Mouse." Emily didn't flinch. "Pay what you owe, or leave the items here." The leader's grin froze, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, the store fell silent. Even his crew seemed unsure of what he'd do next. Then, slowly, he leaned back and laughed. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." He motioned to his crew, who grudgingly pulled a few more crumpled bills from their pockets and tossed them onto the counter. As they gathered their bags and headed for the door, the leader paused, glancing over his shoulder. His eyes locked onto Emily, his grin now more dangerous than amused. "We'll be seeing you around, Mouse," he said. The bell over the door jingled as they left, their laughter echoing faintly behind them. As the door swung shut, the store seemed to exhale collectively. Jessica sank into a chair behind the counter, her hands shaking. "That was insane," David muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Absolutely insane." Jessica turned to Emily, her voice low and urgent. "You can't keep doing this. You're going to get yourself hurt or worse." Emily shook her head. "They were testing us. If we let them walk all over us now, they'll come back and do worse." "But you can't take on a gang by yourself." Jessica snapped. "I'm not planning to," Emily replied evenly. Her co-workers stared at her, trying to make sense of her calm. But Emily didn't offer any further explanations. Instead, she turned and began cleaning up the mess the bikers had left behind. Her movements were steady, purposeful. She wasn't afraid, not of bullies, and not of what was to come. The store settled back into an uneasy rhythm after the bikers left. Customers whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the employees as they hurried to finish their shopping. Emily remained focused, methodically organizing shelves and tidying up the scattered mess the bikers had left behind. But the air was thick with unspoken questions. Jessica couldn't hold it in any longer. "Emily," she hissed, pulling her aside as the last customer exited. "What is your deal? You stood up to them like you knew exactly what you were doing." David chimed in, still pale from the encounter. "Seriously, what's going on? You're, too calm. Those guys are dangerous. And you just stared them down like it was nothing." Emily hesitated, her eyes flickering to the door as if expecting the bikers to return at any moment. Her co-workers deserved some kind of explanation, but she wasn't ready to lay all her cards on the table. "They're just bullies," she said quietly, her tone even. "Bullies like to make noise and show off, but they're not as tough as they want you to think." "That's not an answer," Jessica pressed, crossing her arms. "You're not just some grocery clerk, are you?" Emily let out a small sigh, wiping her hands on a rag. "Look, I've had my share of experience with people like them. That's all." Jessica frowned, clearly unsatisfied. "What kind of experience?" Emily didn't respond. Instead, she returned to her station, stacking cans with deliberate precision. The evening shift dragged on in relative peace. The store emptied out, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly in the quiet. Jessica and David exchanged glances every so often, but neither dared to ask Emily anything else. Around closing time, Emily stood by the front door, her eyes scanning the dark parking lot. The shadows of the street lamps danced across the asphalt, but everything seemed still. Jessica approached cautiously. "Are you expecting them to come back?" Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe. People like that don't like being told no." "Great," David muttered as he walked by, rolling his eyes. "Just what we need, a gang war in aisle 5. Jessica shot him a glare but said nothing. Instead, she turned to Emily. "So what do we do if they do come back?" Emily didn't answer right away. She glanced around the store, taking in every detail: the aisles, the exits, the security cameras that hadn't worked in months. "Lock the doors," she said simply. "Don't let them in." Jessica blinked. "That's it? What about calling the police?" Emily's gaze hardened. "They'd be gone by the time the police got here. And if they find out we called them, it'll only make things worse." Jessica's mouth opened as if to argue, but the determined look on Emily's face silenced her. The clock struck 10 p.m., and the store officially closed for the night. Emily and her co-workers began cleaning up, the usual end-of-shift routine. But just as David flipped the sign to closed, the unmistakable sound of motorcycles rumbled in the distance. Jessica froze, the mop slipping from her hands. "No way," she whispered. The rumble grew louder, vibrating through the walls. Emily moved to the front, her heart steady but her mind sharp. She'd known they would come back. The bikers pulled into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness. There were more of them this time, at least 8, maybe 10. They parked in a loose line, their engines growling before cutting off one by one. "Should we lock the doors?" David asked, his voice trembling. Emily nodded. "Do it now. And turn off the main lights. Keep everything dark." Jessica and David scrambled to follow her instructions, their movements hurried and panicked. Emily, meanwhile, stood near the door, her eyes fixed on the group outside. The leader stepped forward, his silhouette illuminated by the dim glow of the street lamps. He knocked on the glass door with a deliberate rhythm, the sound echoing through the empty store. "Hey, Mouse," he called out, his voice smooth but threatening. "We're just here for a little chat." Emily didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her expression calm. "We know you're in there," the leader continued, his grin visible even in the dim light. "Come on, don't be shy. Open up." Jessica whispered from behind the counter. "Emily, they're going to break in." "No, they're not," Emily said softly. "How can you be so sure?" David hissed, his face pale. "Because they want to scare us first," Emily replied, her voice steady. "They're trying to see if we'll panic." The leader knocked again, harder this time. "What's the matter, Mouse? Lost your nerve?" One of the bikers stepped forward, holding a crowbar. He tapped it against the glass, the sharp sound making Jessica flinch. "Boss, maybe we should just let ourselves in," the wiry man from earlier suggested, his crooked grin back in place. The leader waved him off. "Not yet. Let's give them a chance to be hospitable." Inside, Emily's mind raced. She knew they were testing the waters, trying to gauge their reaction. If they thought they could intimidate her, they'd keep pushing. She stepped closer to the door, her movements deliberate. Her co-workers watched in horror as she placed her hand on the glass, her calm eyes meeting the leader's. "Go home," she said firmly. The leader's grin faltered, just for a moment. The directness of her words caught him off guard. "Go home," he repeated, feigning amusement. "You think you can tell us what to do, little mouse?" Emily didn't blink. "This isn't your playground. You've had your fun. Now leave." The group behind him exchanged glances, some of their bravado starting to waver. The leader, however, wasn't ready to back down. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his voice low. "But guts only get you so far." He motioned to the man with the crowbar. "Break it." Before the man could move, Emily stepped back from the door, her eyes scanning the room. "Get behind the counter," she told Jessica and David. "What about you?" Jessica asked, her voice shaking. "Just do it," Emily replied. As the first blow struck the glass, Emily's calm demeanor shifted slightly. Her muscles tensed, her stance shifting ever so subtly into one of readiness. She was no longer just Emily the grocery clerk. She was Emily the fighter. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. The bikers outside cheered, egging their friend on for another swing. Inside, Emily's mind was razor sharp. She calculated the angles, the timing, the exact moment she'd need to act. She wasn't afraid. This wasn't the first time she'd faced a gang of bullies, and it wouldn't be the last. Another blow landed, the glass spider webbing under the impact. Jessica let out a small gasp, and David muttered a prayer under his breath. But Emily didn't flinch. She stood her ground, waiting for the right moment. The room was charged with disbelief. For a moment, the bikers lay sprawled across the floor, groaning in pain and shock. Emily stood still, her stance loose but ready, as if daring them to try again. Her breathing was calm, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of further resistance. The leader, clutching his wrist, staggered to his feet. His face contorted in a mix of anger and confusion. What are you?" he spat, his bravado faltering for the first time. Emily took a small step forward, her gaze steady and sharp. "I'm the person you shouldn't have messed with," she replied calmly. The man stumbled back, his gang watching her with wide eyes. "You think this is over," he sneered, though his voice trembled. "You can't take all of us." Another biker, younger and slimmer, tried to lunge at Emily from the side. But she caught his movement in her peripheral vision. Pivoting on her heel, she delivered a spinning kick to his chest, sending him sprawling into a display of potato chips. The shelves rattled as bags of chips cascaded around him, adding insult to injury. The sound of crashing snacks broke the trance for the rest of the gang. Two of them charged her at once, their movements clumsy but aggressive. Emily sidestepped the first, catching his arm and using his momentum to throw him to the ground. Before the second could react, she ducked under his swing and delivered a sharp elbow to his ribs, doubling him over. The leader gritted his teeth, his hand fumbling in his jacket. He pulled out a switchblade, flicking it open with a metallic click that echoed in the now silent store. Emily's co-workers gasped from behind the counter. Jessica whispered, "Oh my God, he has a knife." David whimpered, crouching lower behind the counter. "She's going to get herself killed." But Emily didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on the blade, and her expression remained as calm as ever. "That's a bad idea," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of warning. The leader smirked, though his grip on the knife betrayed his nerves. "We'll see about that," he growled, lunging toward her. The world seemed to slow as Emily stepped into action. Her movements were precise, honed through years of relentless training. As the knife came toward her, she sidestepped, grabbing the leader's wrist and twisting it upward. The blade clattered to the floor, and she followed up with a sharp strike to his shoulder, forcing him to drop to his knees. With a swift kick, she sent the knife skidding across the floor, far out of his reach. The leader groaned in pain, cradling his arm as he looked up at her, his confidence shattered. The bikers lay scattered across the store, groaning and clutching their injuries. Emily took a step back, her stance relaxing but her eyes still watchful. She scanned the room, ensuring there were no further threats. Jessica and David peeked over the counter, their faces pale but awestruck. "Did she just?" David trailed off, his jaw slack. "She took down an entire gang," Jessica finished, her voice a mix of disbelief and admiration. The leader struggled to his feet, wobbling as he tried to regain his balance. This isn't over," he muttered, glaring at Emily with what little defiance he could muster. Emily raised an eyebrow, folding her arms. "It's over if you want to leave here in one piece." Her calm but firm tone left no room for argument. The leader hesitated, his pride warring with his survival instinct. Finally, he spat on the floor and motioned for his gang to follow. "Let's go," he barked, his voice weaker than before. One by one, the bikers shuffled out, their bravado replaced with humiliation. As the door swung shut behind them, the store fell into an eerie silence. The tension broke as Jessica and David rushed out from behind the counter, their voices a flurry of questions. "Emily, what the heck was that?" Jessica blurted, her eyes wide. "How do you even know how to fight like that?" David nodded fervently. "Are you some kind of secret agent or something?" Emily let out a soft sigh, running a hand through her slightly disheveled hair. "No, I'm not a secret agent," she said, her tone light but firm. "Then what?" Jessica pressed. Emily hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the door as if to ensure the bikers were truly gone. Finally, she leaned against the counter, her expression softening. "I've been training in mixed martial arts since I was 12, she admitted. "Competed nationally a few years back. It's kind of a big part of who I am." Jessica's jaw dropped. "You're telling me you're some kind of MMA champion, and you've just been stocking shelves this whole time?" Emily shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "Everyone's got a day job." David shook his head in disbelief. "Why didn't you say anything? You could have scared those guys off ages ago." Emily's smile faded slightly. "Because it's not about showing off," she said quietly. "I only use it when I have to." Jessica looked at her, a newfound respect in her eyes. "Well, you definitely used it tonight. That was amazing." The sound of slow, deliberate clapping broke the moment. All three turned to see a little old lady emerging from the frozen food section, her shopping basket dangling from one arm. She had stayed hidden during the chaos but had clearly seen everything. "Well, that was something," she said with a smile, her voice warm. "You've got some serious skills, young lady." Emily felt a blush creeping up her cheeks. Thank you, ma'am." The old woman nodded approvingly. "You remind me of my granddaughter. She's a black belt in karate. Always said people shouldn't underestimate her just because she's small." Jessica grinned, nudging Emily. "Hear that? You've got fans." As the adrenaline began to fade, Emily helped her co-workers clean up the mess left behind by the bikers. The toppled displays and scattered snacks were quickly restored, though the memory of what had happened lingered in the air. When the store was finally in order, Jessica approached Emily again. "You know, you really should tell people about what you can do," she said. "I mean, you're kind of a hero." Emily shook her head, her smile faint but genuine. "I'm not a hero. I just did what needed to be done." Jessica rolled her eyes. "Humble and badass." "Of course." David chimed in from across the room. "Well, remind me never to make you mad. I don't want to end up in the frozen foods aisle." The three of them shared a laugh, the tension finally giving way to relief. By the time Emily walked out into the cool night air, the bikers were long gone. The parking lot was quiet, the street lights casting long shadows on the asphalt. As she locked the doors behind her, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. Not because she had won a fight, but because she had stood her ground and protected what mattered. Sometimes, she thought to herself, strength isn't about who's loudest or biggest. It's about knowing when to act and having the courage to follow through. And as the night swallowed the echoes of the day's events, Emily walked away, ready for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The parking lot was eerily quiet after the bikers had fled, but inside the store, Emily's actions had left an impression. Word of the incident spread quickly among the staff, and by the time the night shift began, almost everyone had heard some version of the story. David and Jessica couldn't stop recounting it, each retelling growing more dramatic than the last. "She didn't just fight them," David exclaimed to another co-worker, his arms flailing for emphasis. "She obliterated them. Like, Bruce Lee meets Wonder Woman kind of stuff." Jessica rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. "Okay, maybe not obliterated, but yes, she was amazing." Emily, however, remained her usual self, stocking shelves and helping customers as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The next morning, the store manager, Mr. Patterson, approached Emily during her shift. His usual nervous demeanor seemed amplified as he adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Emily, a word in my office," he asked, his tone uncertain. Jessica shot her a sympathetic look as Emily followed him to the cramped back office. Inside, Patterson gestured for her to sit, his hands wringing nervously. I heard about what happened last night," he began, his voice wavering. Emily stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "First off," he said, "thank you. I mean, really, thank you. What you did was unexpected. Brave, even." Emily nodded, unsure where this was going. "But," Patterson continued, fidgeting with a stack of papers on his desk, "there are liability issues to consider. You understand, right? If someone gets hurt, even if they're the aggressor, it could come back on the store." Emily's expression didn't change, though she felt a pang of frustration. "So, what are you saying?" "I'm not saying you did anything wrong," he said quickly, holding up his hands. "I just think we need to have a protocol in place for situations like this. Maybe, call the police next time instead of taking matters into your own hands." Emily leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "With all due respect, Mr. Patterson, by the time the police arrived, someone could have been seriously hurt. I wasn't about to stand by and let that happen." Patterson sighed, rubbing his temples. "I get it, I do. But corporate wasn't here," Emily said, her tone firm but calm. There was a long pause before Patterson nodded. "Fair point," he admitted. "Just, be careful, okay?" By the end of the week, customers had started asking about the incident. Some were subtle, throwing curious glances at Emily as they checked out. Others were more direct. "Are you the girl who took down those bikers?" one elderly man asked, his eyes twinkling with admiration. Emily smiled politely. "I just did what anyone else would have done." "Not anyone," he chuckled, handing over his coupons. "You've got guts, young lady." Jessica, standing nearby, chimed in with a smirk. "Guts and skills. Don't forget the skills." Emily shook her head, trying not to let the attention get to her. It was late one evening, just as the store was about to close, when someone unexpected walked through the doors. A tall man with broad shoulders and a confident stride entered, his gaze scanning the aisles until it landed on Emily. "Emily Dawson," he said, his voice warm but commanding. She turned, her eyes widening in recognition. "Coach Harris." Her old MMA coach smiled, walking toward her with a hand extended. "I heard about your little incident," he said. "Didn't take long for the story to reach the gym." Emily shook his hand, a mix of surprise and embarrassment washing over her. "It wasn't a big deal," she said quickly. Harris raised an eyebrow. "Taking down a gang of bikers isn't a big deal? You haven't changed a bit." Jessica, eavesdropping nearby, couldn't resist jumping in. "Wait, you're her coach? So she's really as good as she seems?" Harris chuckled. "Better. Emily was one of the best fighters I've ever trained. She could have gone pro if she wanted to." Jessica's jaw dropped. "Pro? Like, UFC level?" Emily waved her hands dismissively. "That's an exaggeration." "It's not," Harris said firmly. "You've got the discipline, the technique, and the mindset. So why are you here stacking shelves instead of in a ring?" Emily hesitated, glancing around the store. "It's complicated," she said finally. Later that night, after the store had closed, Harris and Emily sat in a small diner down the street. Over cups of coffee, he pressed her for answers. "You disappeared," he said. "One day, you were training harder than anyone else. The next, you were gone. No explanation. What happened? Emily stared into her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. Life happened, she said softly. Harris didn't push, but his silence encouraged her to continue. My mom got sick, she admitted. Medical bills piled up, and I had to take care of her. Fighting wasn't a priority anymore. Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. I get it. Family comes first. But things are different now, right? Emily shrugged. I don't know. I like my life the way it is. Simple, quiet. Quiet doesn't suit you, Harris said with a grin. You were born for more than this, Emily. The conversation with Harris stayed with her long after he left. For the first time in years, Emily found herself questioning her choices. She had left the fighting world behind, but had it ever really left her? Jessica noticed the change in her demeanor. You've been zoning out all day, she said during their break. What's going on? Emily hesitated, then said, do you ever feel like you're meant to do more than what you're doing? Jessica snorted. Every day. But we've got bills to pay, right? Yeah, Emily said, but her tone was distant. A week later, Emily received a call from Harris. I've got a proposition for you, he said. She listened as he explained. A local gym was hosting an MMA exhibition match to raise money for charity. They needed experienced fighters, and Harris wanted her to headline the event. I'm not asking you to make a comeback, he said. Just one fight. For a good cause. What do you say? Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She had spent years trying to leave that world behind. But part of her, a part she had buried deep, missed the thrill of the fight, the sense of purpose it gave her. I'll think about it, she said finally. That night, as she walked home from the store, Emily replayed the events of the past weeks in her mind. The bikers, the attention, the conversation with Harris, it all felt like a sign. She had spent so long hiding her strength, trying to blend in, but maybe it was time to embrace who she really was. The next morning, she called Harris back. I'll do it, she said. And as she hung up, a small, determined smile crossed her face. For the first time in years, Emily felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The crowd in the grocery store erupted into cheers as the last of the bikers was led out, their hands cuffed behind their backs. The manager, Mr. Patterson, couldn't hide his amazement. He approached Emily, looking as if he were seeing her for the first time. Emily, he said, his voice hushed with a mix of awe and disbelief, I had no idea you could do that. Emily offered a small, self-deprecating smile. It's just something I picked up on the side, she replied, her tone casual. She didn't want to make too much of her past, after all, it was behind her now. But the truth was, MMA had shaped her into someone strong, disciplined, and calm under pressure. These were qualities that had served her well at the grocery store. Patterson hesitated for a moment before reaching out to shake her hand. Well, thank you, he said earnestly. I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't stepped in. Emily gave a half shrug. I just did what anyone else would do. They were threatening the safety of everyone here. As the last biker was loaded into the back of the police car, Emily's co-workers, who had been watching the scene with wide eyes, gathered around her. There were pats on the back, whispered congratulations, and even a few hesitant questions. Can we talk about this more? Jessica asked, leaning in close. I mean, really? How did you? Not now, Jess, Emily replied, her voice soft but firm. Maybe later. The store fell back into a sense of normalcy after the police had left. Customers resumed their shopping, though many still threw curious glances at Emily as they passed. It was clear that the story of the biker encounter wasn't going away anytime soon. Later, when everything had settled down, Mr. Patterson found Emily restocking the dairy section. He hesitated before joining her, his hands shoved into his pockets. I spoke to corporate, he said, his gaze not quite meeting hers. Emily continued working, her movements steady and deliberate. What did they say? She asked, not looking up from the row of yogurt cups she was organizing. They wanted to offer you a promotion, he stammered, his eyes finally meeting hers. Something more than just stocking shelves. Management noticed what you did and they want to make sure we keep talent like yours. Emily paused, her hand hovering over a carton of eggs. So, what does that mean? More responsibility. More responsibility, yeah, Patterson said, scratching the back of his head. And more pay. They want you to move into a supervisory role. Emily turned to face him, her expression guarded. And what do you think? Patterson took a deep breath, then smiled slightly. I think it's about time you got recognized for what you can really do. Emily bit her lip, thinking. For so long, she had been content to live a quiet life away from the spotlight. But after last night, things had changed. She couldn't deny that she missed the challenge, the adrenaline of being in control. I'll think about it, she said finally, her voice soft. Patterson nodded, understanding the hesitation. Take your time, he said. It's a big decision. As Emily drove home that evening, the weight of the day pressed heavily on her. The encounter with the bikers had forced her to confront her past, to acknowledge that she wasn't just a grocery clerk, she was capable of more. Jessica called her on the way home, clearly wanting to talk more about what had happened. Are you okay? She asked, her voice filled with concern. Yeah, Emily replied, her tone flat. Just processing everything. You don't have to decide anything right away, Jessica assured her. But whatever you decide, you know we've got your back, right? Emily took a deep breath, looking out at the darkening sky. Yeah, I know. Thanks, Jess. The next morning, Emily went to the gym. Not her regular workout spot at the store, but the place she had trained for years. It was familiar and comforting, the scent of sweat and the constant murmur of heavy bags being hit. Harris was there, already warming up. When he saw her, his face broke into a wide grin. Back for more punishment, he joked. Emily smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. Just trying to figure things out, she said softly. Harris nodded, handing her a pair of gloves. I can help with that. What do you want, Emily? Emily took a deep breath, pulling on the gloves with practiced ease. I don't know. I've spent so long running from this part of my life. Why? Harris asked simply. Because it's hard, she admitted, punching the bag with a controlled force. Because people get hurt sometimes, even me. Harris nodded, his gaze never leaving her. But you know how to handle it, don't you? You've got the skills. Yeah, Emily said after a moment, hitting the bag harder. I do. Then what's stopping you? Harris asked. Emily hesitated, then finally stopped, her breathing heavy. Fear, I guess, she said quietly. Fear of losing what I have now. Or fear of losing yourself, Harris suggested, leaning against the wall. You've changed, Emily. But deep down, you're still the same fighter. Emily wiped her forehead with the back of her glove, her expression thoughtful. Maybe it's time to stop running from who I am. Harris nodded slowly. I think so too. That night, Emily called Patterson back. After a long conversation about the potential promotion, she decided it was time for a change. The offer was good: more responsibility, more pay, and a chance to make a real impact. I'll take it, she said, her voice steady. Patterson's relief was palpable. "That's great, Emily. I knew you'd see it our way." Emily took a deep breath. "I just needed a little push," she admitted. Over the next few weeks, Emily settled into her new role with ease. She was more than just a grocery clerk now, she was a leader, someone who could mentor others and guide them with the same calm confidence she had shown in the face of adversity. Jessica was her biggest cheerleader, always there with encouragement and support. "See," she'd say with a grin. "You're more than just what you were meant to be." Emily would nod, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. "Maybe I was never meant to leave it behind," she would reply, more to herself than to anyone else. As for the bikers, the leader's threats had faded into the background as the store continued on its way. Emily wasn't worried, she had faced much worse in the ring. But as she looked at her reflection in the mirror one morning, she realized that this was just the beginning. She had learned that you could embrace your past without being defined by it. And with her newfound confidence, Emily was ready to face whatever came next, whether in the ring or out of it. As the last customer left the store, and the noise of the day faded away, Emily stood in the quiet of the nearly empty grocery aisle. She looked at the cans she had just restocked, her hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The events of the past few days had felt like a blur: bikers, chaos, the police, but now, it was just her and the shelves. She took a deep breath, her eyes reflecting the calm strength she had discovered within herself. Emily knew that people often made assumptions about those who kept to themselves, thinking them weak, meek, and incapable. But she knew better. She had shown it to everyone who had doubted her. Kindness, she thought, wasn't just a weakness to be taken advantage of. It was a choice, one that required strength to maintain. It was about knowing when to be silent and when to act. Emily had learned that sometimes, being quiet wasn't about being invisible, it was about observing, thinking, and choosing the right moment to strike. Her mind drifted back to that afternoon, the way her body had moved without hesitation when faced with the bikers. In those moments, she hadn't thought of herself as Emily Dawson, grocery clerk. She had thought of herself as the fighter, the one who could defend herself and those around her. It wasn't just about physical strength, it was about resilience, control, and knowing when to use her abilities for the greater good. Emily had once been defined by her fear of being judged, of stepping out of the shadows where it was safe. But now, after facing down those bikers and stepping into the spotlight, she had learned that sometimes the quietest person in the room held the most power. She had shown that power when she didn't back down, when she stood her ground, and when she confronted those who threatened the safety of everyone in the store. Now, as she stood there, stacking cans in perfect rows, she felt a strange sense of peace. The world had a way of overlooking the quiet ones, the ones who didn't make a fuss, who went unnoticed. But Emily knew that sometimes, it was those very people who had the most to offer, the most strength hidden behind their calm exterior. She thought back to the moment when the store manager had offered her the promotion, the chance to step out of the background and lead. It was an opportunity she never would have considered before, too afraid of stepping into the unknown, too worried about losing what little stability she had. But now, as she looked at the clean, organized rows of cans, she knew it was time to embrace change. Sometimes, you have to be pushed to realize your own potential, Emily whispered to herself, her voice barely above a breath. She knew that if she wanted to make a difference, if she wanted to be a role model for others who felt unseen, she had to step up. It wasn't just about taking the promotion, it was about owning who she was, embracing all parts of her past, and using them to move forward. The quietest person in the room often holds the most power. And today, Emily reminded everyone why you should never underestimate the quiet ones. It wasn't about being loud or demanding attention, it was about knowing when to act, when to show strength, and when to lead. As she continued her work, stacking the cans one by one, Emily felt a shift inside her, a quiet confidence that came from knowing her own worth. It wasn't about the bikers, or what they thought of her. It was about proving to herself that she could face any challenge, that she was stronger than she ever gave herself credit for. And as she looked at the neatly stacked rows, she realized that her journey was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still moments when she would have to remind herself of her own strength. But for now, she was ready to step into her new role, ready to show everyone what she was truly capable of. Kindness and strength are choices, Emily thought as she took one last look at her work. And I've chosen to embrace both. With that, she walked away from the aisle, her footsteps confident, her heart at peace with the path ahead. The quiet ones, she knew, often had the loudest impact. And Emily Dawson was ready to make hers.